Hi, this is Sam Rosenfarb, and you're watching the White Collar Crime Report. With me tonight are two of America's best-known criminal defense attorneys, Joseph Hayden of Hayden, Pearl & Silber, law firm in Weehawken, New Jersey, and Alfred Dakotas of Dakotas, Phillips, Lunston & Bronster, law firm in Roseland, New Jersey. Joe, tell us about how you got started defending criminals.
Sam, thanks for the invitation. I was in the Attorney General's office for 3 years. I was involved in prosecution and investigation of organized crime and political corruption. Al and I started a law firm, and frankly, I anticipated a general practice. It just so happened that because I had been in high publicity cases while I was working with the state, the type of cases which came to me were white-collar cases and high-profile cases, and I started from there.
That's terrific. Al, what was your start like?
Well, I started out putting people in jail for committing crimes. I was an assistant U.S. attorney under Fred Lacey and Herb Stern back in the late 60s. And having spent several years as a prosecutor, I went out, ultimately became a defense attorney, joined forces with Joe Hayden, and we took it from there. So
you were partners at one time?
Yes.
How's it different defending criminals as opposed to putting criminals in jail, prosecuting them?
There's probably a lot more emotional responsibility representing a life, and perhaps you come to know the family. From an advocacy point of view, it's really the same. There are certain facts, there are certain contested facts, and you try to marshal the evidence to go with your side. But when you're a prosecutor, really you're talking about representing the government, and when you're a defense attorney, you're representing a live human being and a family. So I feel emotionally it's much tougher doing defense work.
Have you experienced the same thing, Al?
Well, what I found is when I was an assistant U.S. attorney, I had the entire wherewithal of the federal government behind me as a prosecutor. I had the FBI, I had the Internal Revenue Service.
What's their role, the FBI's role in a case? How do they differ from the investigation performed by the U.S. attorneys themselves?
Well, the investigation generally is conducted by an FBI agency or the IRS itself. The U.S. Attorney's Office has the right to convene a grand jury, subpoena witnesses, and have the witnesses actually come into the grand jury. But it's a combination of using the agents to go out and make preliminary contacts with the witnesses, as opposed to a subpoena which you can call the witness right into the grand jury.
Are they directed by the U.S. Attorney's Office primarily in these investigations?
Generally, they work very closely and hand in hand with the prosecutor, because the prosecutor is ultimately responsible for how the case proceeds.
Joe, you prosecuted the first wiretap case in New Jersey. Tell our viewers first what a wiretap is, and then what makes that so interesting.
I don't know whether it's particularly interesting, Sam, but
it's
one of the most far-reaching forms of surveillance and evidence gathering we have under the Constitution. A wiretap must be approved by a judge on the basis of a factual showing that there is probable cause that a telephone facility has been used in the past and will be used in the future for a certain type of crime.
A wiretap is what we know of as bugging a phone line?
That's right, okay. And recording the conversations, as opposed to eavesdropping or bugging, which would be recording conversations in a room, not necessarily over a wire. At the time,
is there a legal distinction between bugging the room and bugging the phone?
In other words, you have to go in for authorization pursuant to a wiretap order for either one, but there's a difference between bugging a telephone line, which is fairly limited, and bugging a room where you're going to pick up every conversation that occurs within the room.
I see.
And but the act, which permits both bugging and wiretapping, permits both upon a showing of probable cause that the place which will be bugged, or the phone facility, will lead to incriminating evidence. I tried the first case on behalf of the Attorney General's Office, Division of Criminal Justice, and the State Police in Atlantic County in 1971. It was actually a routine case, a gambling conspiracy, 5 or 7 defendants. What made it unique was that every facet of the wiretapping was contested, from how they put the tap in, to who the monitors were, to what happened with the tapes.
What was the basis of their dispute? What did they claim happened?
The defense didn't know what happened, but they didn't know whether or not we could even introduce the wiretapping and introduce the tapes, so they fought us tooth and cranny all the way till eventually the evidence went in, and the case resulted in a conviction. But it took us a week to even lay the foundation to get the tapes in, whereas now it's normally done in a matter of hours because nobody bothers to contest it anymore.
You mean the defense contested the legality of bugging their phones?
Not only the legality, but the integrity of the evidence from the time the tap was first installed, to the conversation was first listened to the tapes were first sealed, until logs were made of the conversations, to how outgoing telephone calls were retrieved. Every minute step was contested by the defense at that time, and it was appropriately so.
And nonetheless, you won your position.
Well, because the evidence on the tapes were overpowering.
With today's technology, is it easy to doctor the tapes gathered in a bugging operation?
Well, in today's technology, if somebody were so inclined, it would be possible to doctor tapes, and what you'd have to do is re-record conversations which were first recorded, splicing out what you didn't particularly want. There's also fairly sophisticated expert technology available which might catch that, and experienced defense attorneys frequently have tapes checked to see whether there's any doctoring.
And that could be checked today?
Yes, it could be checked today.
Interesting. Al, you were part of the team that prosecuted Gyp DeCarlo.
Correct.
What did he do? What was he accused of?
Gyp DeCarlo was involved, he was alleged to and actually found guilty of extorting a person by the name of Louis Saperstein, extorting him out of money. Ultimately, Louis Saperstein was found dead, and there was some suggestion that he had actually come to untoward means involving his death.
I mean, the prosecution was based on this one incident of extortion?
Correct.
And what business was Louis Saperstein?
Louis Saperstein was a restaurateur, and he was in the finance business. And ultimately, he got hooked up with Gyp DeCarlo and some of the organized crime people, and they started to extort him. Ultimately, as I said, he was convicted. And in that case, which was one of the most celebrated cases in America in its time, there were a series of wiretaps. And there you had wiretaps which had been secretly recorded in a restaurant on Route 22 in Union County. And the conversations in those tapes related to some of the highest ranking people in the country. Congressmen were mentioned, federal judges were mentioned. As a matter of fact, that's the case that they mentioned the fact that, quote, Governor Byrne couldn't be bought.
Oh, was he a judge at the time?
He was a judge at the time, and the governor, now governor,
right,
former Governor Byrne, used the tape where the mob bosses said Governor Byrne, who was then a prosecutor and then later on a judge, was so honest that they couldn't corrupt him. And he used that quite effectively when he ran for governor to show that he was honest and that the people should support him, which they did.
That was post-Watergate era.
Correct.
When all politicians were thought to be dishonest.
That case was, unlike Joe's case, which in Joe's case was very precedent-setting. In
your case with Gyp DeCarlo was after Joe's case?
Before, I think.
Right before.
Before.
In my case, however,
yes.
Federal
wiretapping rules were clearer than state.
Well, here's interesting. Our tapes were all illegally obtained.
Illegally?
Illegally obtained. The tapes themselves were not used
before you go on,
at the trial.
The FBI illegally bugged this restaurant?
For months. And they had thousands and thousands of hours of conversations in which various organized crime people would talk about their illicit relationships with high-ranking people like Mayor Adonisio in Newark, some high-ranking judges.
Is that common for the FBI to illegally bug?
In those days, the
telephones?
standards were much less severe, and it was a common practice many years ago, and this is in the 60s, for there to be illegal tapes. So when the tapes were released, they were never used into the actual trial itself, because they couldn't be. They were illegally obtained, they were inadmissible. Yet the entire public got an inside view of what organized crime was and the tentacles that they had because of an illegal tape.
So the purpose of the tapes was to provide information, not to provide evidence.
Gathering. That's right. And what happened is the notoriety from the case Al was in and another case involving Sam DeCavalcanti in the late 60s.
That's Sam the plumber.
That's right. Gave rise to certain test cases which went before the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court declared wiretapping could be legal under certain limited circumstances, and then the federal government and the state of New Jersey passed a statute permitting wiretapping under certain limited circumstances. And it was the case I tried in the early 70s, which was the first time that statute was tested when the wiretapping occurred pursuant to the statute, and the federal people had it too. So legal use of wiretapping really didn't occur to the early 70s.
So today's legal use came as a result of these test cases?
Sure.
Gyp DeCarlo and Sam the plumber?
And the cases that Joe handled. What's interesting to note is that when Joe handled the wiretap cases, the wiretaps were very, very infrequently used. It was a rare instance in which a prosecutor could actually put a tape on. Today, it's the rare circumstances when the prosecutor doesn't put a tape on. As a matter of fact, defense counsel routinely used the argument that how could there be any evidence of a crime? There was no tape to corroborate what the witnesses are saying. So we now use the lack of a wiretap.
You mean because they're so prevalent?
Absolutely. As affirmative evidence that there could not possibly be a crime, because if there was, there would have been a tape.
That's very interesting. You were involved you had a role in the Abscam case for the for those of our viewers who don't remember. That's where the government enticed people to commit crimes. What was your role in that, Al?
My client's name was Joseph Silvestri. He was a legitimate real estate broker in South Jersey. He was told by some intermediaries.
He was a real estate broker or a stockbroker?
No, a real estate broker. Sold real estate, helped develop business real estate projects. He was told by some intermediaries that a very, very wealthy sheik was coming into this country to put in millions and millions, actually hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to build up the state of New Jersey, to create jobs, to create property.
Sounds admirable.
It was a wonderful opportunity. As he got to meet them, these sheiks turned out to be, in fact, FBI undercover agents. And after they had...
Did they wear the garb, the Arab garb and all?
The actual sheik did. But Mr. Silvestri, who was and is a legitimate person, in my view, was ultimately told, look, in order for you to do this real estate development project with the sheik, which will net you a legitimate figure of $6 million as a brokerage fee, the sheik must get some immigration papers approved so that he can come into this country.
Right.
Mr. Silvestri,
otherwise, he won't be able to pay.
Or if he's not in the country, he can't invest in New Jersey.
Right.
Mr. Silvestri said, look, this is not a problem. You can go to any congressman and you make your pitch and they will get approval to allow him to stay in this country. But the undercover agents kept saying, no, the Arab wants, because of the Arabian sheik, wants to meet the congressman, and it's a custom to hand him some money just because it's his custom not to take anything for nothing. And Silvestri would say, look, it's not necessary. These are legitimate congressmen. They want to help investment. They want to help business in New Jersey. Ultimately, Mr. Silvestri was there when money changed hands between the sheiks and their representatives and the congressman.
He was in the room.
He was in the room. But the reality was this. If Mr. Silvestri hadn't had his hook in his mouth, a $6 million brokerage fee back in the late 70s, Mr. Silvestri would have never stayed in a room where money, cash passed hands. That was the kind of thing that all of us in the Abscam case, and there were Congressman Thompson out of New Jersey, a whole host of congressmen throughout the country, they all argued, look, we never had a predisposition to commit this crime. We would have never taken bribes. We've never taken bribes. But once you put hundreds of thousands of dollars in front of us, and in Silvestri's case, the allure of $6 million, you make them do things that they would not ordinarily have done. And the government ought not be in the business of inducing people who are not inclined to commit a crime to actually do something that crosses the bounds. Everyone in Abscam was convicted. I still say to this day, that's not what the American judicial system is all about.
Silvestri was convicted as well?
He was convicted and he served several years in jail.
That's too bad.
It was very sad.
Could that happen today, Joe? With today's climate, political climate?
Well, of course it could happen today. My problem has always been, in terms of entrapment, that we know as far back as the book of Genesis, that if people are made known to the right inducements, they sooner or later will fall. And I don't think it is the business of government to create crime, nor do I think it's the business of government to institute crime. I think that government should go out and prosecute already completed crime.
With that thought, please hold it for just 1 second. We'll be back after a short break with the White Collar Crime Report, more discussion on Abscam and other political crimes. Hi, this is Sam Rosenfarb. Welcome back to the White Collar Crime Report. We have with us tonight two of America's most competent white-collar criminal attorneys, Al Dakotas and Joe Hayden. Right before the break, we were talking about Abscam and Al's role defending one of the those indicted and ultimately convicted. Joe, tell us about one of your favorite cases, most interesting cases.
Well, when you do defense work, I don't think there's any such thing as a fun case or a fun trial because the responsibility is too great. And they're all interesting when you do them. I think in some ways the case that is the most memorable to me is a death penalty case I tried, which was a lovers triangle murder case that was prosecuted by the prosecutor of Somerset County in the early 80s. And what makes a death penalty case so difficult is you are dealing with the ultimate sanction of the law, which is a death penalty, and a lawyer has almost a compulsion to leave no stone unturned in terms of trying to defend his or her client because of what the sanction is.
Is every murder case a death penalty case in the state?
And again, there had been a death penalty in this country for centuries. There was a period of time that the United States Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional. That decision at some point in time was reversed when there was a different majority in the Supreme Court. And now there is a statute on the books which permits the death penalty under certain very limited circumstances. And it was back in the early 80s that the state of New Jersey reinstituted the death penalty and began to prosecute death penalty cases in egregious situations.
And the murder case has to fit the criteria of the death penalty.
That's right, and there have to be the type of aggravating circumstances which cause prosecutors to decide to seek it. It's a very time-consuming process to try such a case, and from a lawyer's point of view, it is particularly gut-wrenching. And as a matter of fact, I have seen hardened prosecutors and judges, the first time the jury is assembled, have difficulty getting the word death out of their mouths. I have literally seen a judge have trouble saying the word when he was first telling the jury what the case was about, because you realize in the real world, in the courtroom where it could be applied, the word death has a whole new meaning in terms of the seriousness of it. And everybody across the board is...
This was a very celebrated case. Is this a case of an individual who's found in a drum?
Yes. This was an individual who supposedly was engaged in premeditated murder of his lover's husband, supposedly lured him to a house, killed him, cut the body up, put it in a 55...
His own house? What?
No, a different house. Then cut the body up, put it in a 55-gallon drum, and buried it in the backyard of his own house. I think it was ABC television or one of the television stations was there when the body was discovered after about a 48-hour search, and out in Somerset County it was kind of a cause celeb.
So you represented the man accused of cutting up this body, putting it into a 55-gallon drum, burying it in his backyard?
Yes.
And he was ultimately acquitted of murder.
He was acquitted of premeditated murder because and the defense was self-defense, where there was a fight at the first house, and then everything he did afterwards made the situation more tragic and more dire, but was really inconsistent with premeditation. And part of my argument was, if somebody is going to kill somebody, they're going to have a better way to do it and a better way to dispose of the body than a spontaneous fight with blood all over the place. But it's very interesting, the difference in the science between the time I tried that death penalty case in '83, where really all they could do was match blood type, and say now the O.J. Simpson case, where they can even match blood type to about 0.57%. They now have DNA. The science has advanced in the last 10 years, light years, as opposed to even what it was a decade ago.
Al, is it different representing a individual accused of a violent crime as opposed to a white-collar crime?
Yes. First of all, when you're dealing with white-collar criminals, it's easier to relate to them because nowadays what you represent doctors, you represent lawyers.
They're accused of tax fraud,
yes,
bank fraud.
Bank fraud, insurance fraud. You're dealing with people who, frankly, you're very honored to be in the same room with. So there's a certain amount of empathy that you have for them because they're charged with some, oftentimes, technical violation of a federal law. Violent crimes, there are some cases that I just simply can't get my heart into. If there's a particularly rough sexual charge, if there's a child molestation charge,
Well, Joe's talking about defending somebody cut up into little pieces.
Frankly,
who cut somebody up into little pieces.
The person who's cut up into little pieces is called the decedent.
Right. You're representative.
He didn't need any representation, that person.
He was already buried before he was buried.
The violent crimes are emotionally a little bit more difficult to deal with as a practical rule. But the reality is if you believe in your client, if you believe that he has a right to be tried fairly and honestly and be afforded all the same rights as anyone else, whether he is involved with the incident or not, then you can do both. But it's just preferable for me to represent white-collar criminals.
It's interesting that both of you were prosecutors and now defense attorneys, and you see your roles as not extremely different, and yet as a layperson, it seems that prosecuting criminals, knowing that they're guilty, watching their defense counsel represent them, advocate their position, possibly knowing that they're guilty, causes a wide spectrum of emotions that seem to me to be extremely disparate, totally different
But the key word is the word you use, which is called advocacy. A good lawyer should be able to ethically and professionally argue either side of an issue. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, you could take either side. You could take either side in any kind of debate issue and argue it ethically and professionally.
But there is a right and wrong.
Well, let me finish. Our system is an outgrowth of the English system. And in the English system, where they have solicitors and barristers, they do not have full-time prosecutors. And some of the barristers for the Crown or the Queen at any given point in time could be prosecuting a case and in the following month defending a case and prosecuting a case.
That exists today?
Yes, in the English system, because it's believed in the advocacy and ethics and professionalism. And if you believe in the system, you believe a lawyer should be able to argue both sides, and it's ultimately the judge or the jury which will decide what the facts are.
I think as a follow-up to that, if Joe Hayden represents a murderer, that does not mean that he advocates murdering people. If I represent, no, but it doesn't. Quite the contrary. If I'm asked to represent someone who's a tax cheater, that does not mean I want to encourage all the people to go out and not to pay their taxes. It's part of the system. We have a system which says that you should be treated fairly according to the Constitution, that all your rights should be afforded you. All Joe's job as a defense attorney is, or if I was ever when I was a prosecutor, is to make sure that you go through the checklists of rights and responsibilities for each defendant and he'd be treated just like everybody else. Whether you win or you lose, as the prosecutor, when I was a prosecutor, it didn't matter whether I won or lost. It's just that the trial was proceeding fairly. As a defense attorney, obviously I'm an advocate, and it's my job to do as very best I can to get an acquittal. And I would like to win.
And typically
for
the two of you
client.
do win.
Well,
but Sam, let me ask you a question. They say that the jury system is the worst of all systems except for everything else. And let's assume
Very well put.
Let's assume you or a family member were in some southern state or some state out west and got jammed up by a local cop who didn't like you. Would you want to be tried by a computer? Would you want to be tried by a judge? Or would you want to be tried by a jury? And if you were tried by a jury, would you not want some lawyer who would ethically and professionally argue on behalf of you or your family member when perhaps you are the subject of overzealous government? And that's the real role of defense attorneys.
No, I'd certainly want a Joe Hayden or an Al Dakotas defending me. That's true, rather than a computer or a judge.
You want the jury to decide it, but you want a skilled lawyer to do it in an appropriate way.
Correct. What's special counsel? Both of you as distinguished defense attorneys have been appointed special counsel of a water commission, special counsel of a municipality. What
Joe, why
makes
don't
it
you answer
special?
that question about labor unions?
Well, it's an interesting kind of progression that our careers have had. We've gone from being prosecutors to defense counsel of all kinds of cases. And as of the last few years, both municipal governments and labor unions have asked us in various matters to be special litigation counsel for certain types of matter. What a special counsel is not the tenured annual counsel who's paid an annual salary. It is not somebody who is paid a specific retainer, but it's for a special piece of complex litigation where they want to bring somebody in and where the counsel will not commit themselves more than the one case to come in as special counsel, as I have for the city of Newark, in connection with the ongoing grand jury investigation for the past couple of years.
And on behalf of the Water Commission, is that similar role?
Similar type of thing. They bring you in for a specialized function. With respect to labor unions, Joe and I were brought in as special counsel for a large Atlantic City union that was charged by the federal government as to being corrupt and being involved with organized crime. Joe's function for the funds and my function for the union was basically to see to what extent the government's allegations about people who worked in the union and therefore were under our jurisdiction, to what extent the allegations were correct, that they were, quote, bad guys, and to what extent they weren't bad guys, that they were just being falsely accused. And our job with the federal government was to sit down and ultimately make an honest appraisal as to when we agreed with the government and when we disagreed. In those circumstances where we disagreed with the government, we would prove, we would become like defense counsel.
Sounds like you're working with the government.
Well, what we do is we try to arrive at a just resolution. So some of the individuals in the union were asked to leave, and we wanted them to leave. The others that we felt were being unfairly accused, we would persuade the government that based upon the facts that we had accumulated, that they shouldn't be removed from office, and they weren't.
Do many people go to trial? Do many people go to jail after trial? Or do a lot of these cases settle?
Well, I mean, in terms of criminal cases, they say about 5 to 10% of the cases are actually resolved by a jury trial in the federal system, and most of our work is within the federal system.
So 90 to 95% settle prior to a trial.
They plead guilty.
That's right.
They plead, and the way to settle is to plead guilty. Is it? Can you convince the prosecutor to go away?
However, no, you don't. Well, once there's an indictment, you never convince the prosecutor to go away. Pre-indictment, many times, some of the greatest results that either Al or I have had have been convincing law enforcement authorities not to indict, because sometimes that's obviously better than acquittal, because the defendant obviously doesn't go through the aggravation.
You're now at different law firms. At one time, you were both partners of the same firm. What caused you to separate?
Well, really two things. Number one, we began to run into a conflict situation where in multiple defendant cases, perhaps with a number of defendants, somebody would come to me, somebody would come to Al, and since, if you remember, the same law firm, you can't represent two people who may have adverse interests, so one of us would have to drop out. And that really kind of cut down on some business. And there's kind of another personal thing that, this is a family show, do you really want me to say what happened? Both Al and I in our office were right across the street from the Newark Y. And I used to go over to Newark Y every day and play racquetball. And Al was a former boxer and actually fought in the Golden Gloves and
he was a champ at the Golden Gloves.
Olympic trials. In the Olympic trials, he used to go over and work on the heavy bag, and he used to see me playing racquetball. So eventually, one day, Al came to me and challenged me to a game of racquetball, and I beat him 21-0.
And each point was painful. Each point was painful.
And after I beat him 21-0, he perceived the conflict and asked to split the firm.
Modesty prevents me from telling you the real facts in that last scenario.
Well, with that, thank you very much for appearing on White Collar Crime Report. This is Sam Rosenfarb for the White Collar Crime Report. Don't let the greed get you. If you have any questions about tonight's show, write to me, Sam Rosenfarb, 75 Livingston Avenue, Roseland, New Jersey, 07068.
And Sam,
thanks
because
again,
of the invitation, you get a free subpoena from Al.
Hi, this is Sam Rosenfarb, and you're watching the White Collar Crime Report. With me tonight are Adam Mangino, Executive Director of Dalen Associates, one of America's premier investigative firms, and Gerald Cravaton, one of America's finest criminal defense attorneys and a partner in the law firm of Lowenstein Sandler of Roseland, New Jersey. Adam and Jerry have worked together in defending some of the most widely celebrated white-collar defendants in the nation. Jerry, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started defending white-collar criminals.
Sure, Sam. I went to Rutgers Law School and worked
Great
clerked.
law school.
Well, I thought so.
Yeah,
I
my
still
son
do.
is a student there.
Oh, is that right?
They finally won a basketball.
Right.
And I worked at Lowenstein Sandler when I was at the law school and when I graduated, and I've been at this firm ever since I graduated from law school. And when I came to the firm, Matt Boylan, who is a senior partner there, one of the name partners in the firm, had just been back from Trenton. He had served as the director of the Division of Criminal Justice, which is really the top criminal law enforcement job in the Attorney General's office. And Matt then had a lot of business and does still in this area, in the white-collar crime area. And I was lucky enough to hook up with Matt.
That's real nice. Adam, you're a former DEA agent.
Yeah.
Tell us, how did you get started in forming your own firm?
Well, more years ago than I'd like to admit. In college, I was a pre-med student, and I was going to be a doctor. And then at some point in the third year in, I decided that probably wouldn't be exciting enough for the things I'd like to do, since I went to Clemson. I was there on a football scholarship. So I decided that being a federal agent was something I'd like to try.
So you went from knocking heads on the gridiron to knocking heads.
Yeah, well, I don't know that I'd like to admit to that, but in fact, I'll disavow any of those comments.
Okay, good.
In any case, strangely enough, I saw a ad in a Boys Life magazine. Cousin was going to camp, and it said federal agents needed. I sent in, I took the test, and was chosen.
And there you were.
And there I was, became an agent, spent 9 or 10 years with the government as an agent during an arrest on a heroin deal, actually with a former Plainfield police officer. I gave the arrest signal, they missed the signal. I had to make the arrest. In doing that, we chased some people down the street and up into an apartment where there were some guns. I ran through a door. I was back on the football field again. Herniated a disc in my back, and 2 years later had a medical retirement as a result of that.
And that's what caused you to start your own firm?
Yeah, basically. I mean, I had an interim period. I went to the Ocean County Prosecutor's Office for about 1.5 years, 2 years, and was in the Special Investigations Unit. Learned enough there about what was going on in the state to get out and start my own firm.
How is it different being on the investigative side for defense versus being on the prosecution side?
It takes a lot more imagination. Your resources are limited, and things that you want you don't automatically get. So it's a lot more work.
Jerry, you've worked together with Adam on some of these cases. Tell us something about one of your cases.
Sure. I guess the first case that we worked on together, Adam and I, was the defense of Wally Lindsley, who at the time was the mayor of Weehawken, the youngest mayor in the state at the time, in the early, mid-1980s. And if you recall, Sam, Wally was the first and only person who was indicted on the testimony of David Friedland, the former state senator from Hudson County, from Jersey City.
What I recall about David Friedland is that they couldn't find him for a while.
Well, Adam found him, I must tell you that. I mean, very few people know that we came that close to breaking that case wide open, and it was really through the efforts of Adam that we did that. I mean, that's typical. A good investigator makes a lawyer look good in these kinds of cases.
How did you find him?
Well, we had the ability to do some traveling in the case, and we went down to a place called Rum Cay, a small island in the Caribbean, which was really difficult duty.
I imagine.
Yeah, flew down in a small plane. There was no taxi cab on the island, so the plane ride took us to the hotel. We landed on the beach, and he drove us to the hotel. While we were there, we interviewed a person who was an integral part of the case, someone who had set up some offshore banking accounts and things of that nature, developed some information which led back to the mainland. We came back to Florida to an apartment of a woman named, I'm not going to believe this, Colette Golightly.
Golightly.
Sounds like a bad novel, but it was true. It was David Friedland's girlfriend. About that time, David Friedland had faked his own death as a result of a shark attack. And I know we didn't believe it. I don't know how anybody else felt about it. So we went to the...
It does sound very incredible.
Yeah, well, we went
Shark
to the...
attacks, girlfriend named Golightly.
Yeah, well, we thought it was a new way to test cocaine. You know, you used it, you jumped in, and if you didn't come up, a shark got you. You know, we weren't sure. We thought of patting as a government testing thing. In any case, we went to the apartment and found out that Colette Golightly and a male fitting David Friedland's description had moved out 2 days after his death, which was kind of interesting that we had a dead man, we thought, walking around. So we brought the information back, and eventually with Jerry, channeled it in the right direction. We set up or proposed to set up a surveillance with children that involved Colette Golightly's kids, which eventually led to India to the apprehension.
Jerry, you represented one of the individuals involved in the Crazy Eddie scandal.
That's correct.
What was that all about? You know, we all remember the commercials, Crazy Eddie commercials. We all remember the notoriety of Crazy Eddie, Eddie Antar, leaving
Sure.
the country with millions of dollars. You represented his brother, right?
Yes, I represented his brother Alan Antar. And there were 3 people indicted in that case. Eddie was the lead defendant, who was represented by Jack Arsenal. His brother Mitchell Antar was represented by Jack Ford in that case. And I had Alan Antar, the 3rd brother, who was the one who was acquitted in the case.
The only acquittal in the Crazy Eddie case. That's quite an accomplishment.
Well, it was a combination of facts and luck, and I like to think a little bit of advocacy, but yeah, it was the,
Yeah.
the acquittal in the case.
Seems the harder you work, the luckier you get. Well, what were both brothers working for the company at the time that they were indicted?
Yeah, Alan had a different role than Mitchell and clearly Eddie. Alan was unique. He had always had one foot in the family and one foot out of the family. There were constant disputes that he had between with Eddie and some of the other family members. And that family was really ripped apart.
Did he have disputes regarding this fraud that they were ultimately indicted and convicted for?
Well, it's to this day, I don't accept the fact that Eddie and Mitchell, who were convicted of the fraud, were the quote-unquote masterminds of it. I mean, I really think that this could not have occurred but for the efforts of their cousin, a guy named Sam E. Antar, who was really the only one, an accountant Sam, I'm sorry to say, but really the only one who knew enough about the inner workings of the company to have created the kinds of sophisticated manipulation
And was he
devices.
indicted as well, this Sam
No,
Antar?
well, Sam Antar managed to escape any real liability in the case, as did his father, Eddie Antar, different spelling from Crazy Eddie, and the other side of the family that sided with Sam E. Antar as opposed to Crazy Eddie Antar and his side of the family.
And what do you think happened? Do you think the government just didn't want to pursue Sam E. Antar? Or
well, I
did they
think,
see it differently than you?
No, I think they were desperate to make the case. The SEC had been involved in this case before the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Newark was involved. This was a major case for the SEC. It became an embarrassment not only to the agency, but to the court when Eddie fled the country in violation of a court order. And so it became a major priority for law enforcement.
Your client didn't flee with his brother, did he?
No, no, no. Neither Mitchell nor Alan fled the country. That was only Eddie. And it was clear that the government's focus was on Eddie, and they wanted to make that case. And then when Sam E. eventually decided to cooperate, because he was in a position of incredible vulnerability.
Was he granted some immunity as a result of cooperating?
He was granted immunity. He got a great deal with the SEC. I mean, Sam E. Antar not only became the central witness in the case,
he masterminded the prosecution as well.
He ran
the crime and the prosecution.
He ran the company for the last 6 months that the company was in existence. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars went through his hands in those last months.
Well,
So
we could spend 3 more shows talking about Crazy Eddie.
That's
one
true.
of the most celebrated fraud cases in white-collar crime history, I think.
no question about it.
Yeah.
Sam.
Adam, you were involved in another very interesting white-collar crime case, the John DeLorean case.
Yeah, that was an interesting
Tell us
investigation.
about that. I remember, the only thing I remember, the most interesting thing I remember about DeLorean is the design of his cars, which I thought were great.
Yeah.
Tell us about the white-collar crime case.
Well, the case itself was an interesting case. It was another one where the government had targeted someone who was well-known, and they were going to get their pound of flesh, and it was an interesting case, and they could get a lot of publicity. And basically what they did was they set up a sting operation where an FBI agent posed as a bank officer. DeLorean's company in Ireland was in need of funding. He met with this FBI agent introduced through an informant. The FBI agent guaranteed him that he would give him an amount of money. An informant stayed in the middle of the case. The amount of money happened to be suggested by the informant, and it also happened to coincide with an amount that a drug dealer in California needed to buy drugs that he was going to import into the United States. The informant controlled the case and controlled what was going on between the players. And DeLorean showed up at a hotel in Los Angeles fully expecting to have a loan agreement fulfilled. When he walked into the hotel room,
DeLorean's objective was to get financing for
his company, right.
Sounds admirable enough.
Yeah, well, when he walked into the hotel room, he walked in and sat down. The government had cameras going, and it was bugged, and they were listening in. And they had two people come in and put a suitcase with 20 pounds of cocaine, or 20 kilos, I can't remember right now which it was, in front of him, and they opened it up. And I don't know what they expected him to do.
What was his interest in cocaine?
Well, he didn't have any. I mean, in the initial report, it was interesting. The initial report's the only report I've ever seen that the government prepared where they actually talked about entrapment. You know, the initial case initiation report authored by the government agent that initiated that investigation said that he had checked with the U.S. Attorney's Office relative to entrapment. In my 25 years in this business, I've never seen that done. And I had just come from DEA, and I knew it wasn't a part of the DEA reporting requirements.
Right.
So DeLorean, sitting in a room, they open up a suitcase and take out 2 pounds of cocaine, and again, what they expected him to do, I don't know. What they eventually did is they arrested him in the room with the cocaine. We first realized it was a sting when there was no evidence report, because there wasn't any evidence seized. It was their cocaine. Yeah. So I actually used his name to get this other drug dealer, a fellow named Morgan Hetrick, involved in the case, because Morgan Hetrick didn't believe the government informant. So DeLorean's name became credibility for the informant. And that's the way the whole case unfolded.
And did they ultimately indict this Morgan Hetrick?
They ultimately indicted Morgan Hetrick. I believe he got convicted. Yeah.
But DeLorean then was just a side player in
well,
a scheme to get...
Yeah, he was a side player, but he was the name of the case. And interestingly enough, he was arrested with cocaine, but the case initiation report where they talked about entrapment was a heroin case initiation report according to the government's own classification. And in it they said he had no overseas connections, he had no money, and he had no place to sell the drugs. And yet they made the case anyway.
Can the government just entrap anybody with substantial amounts of drugs, cocaine, heroin? I guess they could just come into a room and open up these drugs, and that's evidence of a crime in progress, I guess. And then it's up to a good defense attorney to offer some explanation for what that person was doing there.
Yeah, that's.
What was your role with DeLorean?
Well, I was the lead investigator in the case. My first role was to do an analysis of the government's discovery to find out what was going on. When it happened, no one had any concept as to who was involved. We were all trying to figure out who the players were. So I went through the paperwork to see what I could understand as a result of the classifications that the government was using, and then I wrote up the discovery request. So we could ask for enough information to go back and say, okay, now we've got this, and it shows that these things really didn't happen. Really, what happened in this case?
Fascinating story. This is Sam Rosenfarb for the White Collar Crime Report. We'll be back in a short period of time with Gerald Cravaton and Adam Mangino. Hi, this is Sam Rosenfarb for the White Collar Crime Report. With me are Jerry Cravaton and Adam Mangino, defense attorney and private investigator. Tell us, Jerry, how does a defense attorney use an investigator in furtherance of his advocacy of his client? You know, we've all watched Perry Mason and his investigator,
sure,
Paul Drake.
Sure, that's right. Well, I was going to ask you what his name was. I remember Della Street.
Does it work
before your time?
Does it work? Does it work like we've seen on TV?
Well, it's surprisingly similar. Let's put it that way, Sam. I mean, there is no question that the investigator makes or breaks the case. because in most situations the law is not in dispute. It's the facts that are going to be in dispute in a criminal investigation. And the investigator is the white-collar criminal defense lawyer's first tool and major tool in line of defense. So you've got to make sure that you have the right investigator in the case right up front.
You recently represented the New Jersey Democratic Committee. What was your role, and did Adam play a role in that as well?
Sure. I got into the case because my partner Ted Wells is the general counsel for the Democratic State Committee in New Jersey. Ted, at the time that case broke, was involved in a major trial and couldn't have a hands-on day-to-day responsibility for it.
Tell us about that case, because it's a very interesting case.
Well, it's the case that evolved out of the comments that were made by Ed Rollins after Governor Whitman's victory in the gubernatorial race last year. If you recall, Rollins said that the Whitman campaign and the Republican State Committee had paid ministers, African-American ministers, as well as Democratic Party workers, in order to suppress the African-American vote in the gubernatorial election. And we took that case.
That was Rollins' boast.
That was Rollins's boast, but at the time it appeared as though it was more than a boast. And to this day, I'm not satisfied that it was simply a boast. So we took that case, we filed a civil rights complaint in the federal court in Newark here, and we then went about in a very compressed period of time trying to prove the case. And what we had sought in the complaint was to overturn the results of the gubernatorial election. That, unfortunately, became a lot of the media focus in the case. But we were also attempting to remedy what had been an established pattern of misconduct by the Republican State Committee.
What would have happened if you won the case? Assuming you got what you sought, what would have been the result? Would you have had another election?
It depends on how the facts had played out, Sam. If the facts had established that Governor Whitman had won the election as a result of the suppression of the African-American vote, we would have moved to overturn the election. Those facts were not there, and I want to emphasize that quite clearly. We investigated them thoroughly, and that's where Adam came in. Adam was the chief investigator for the Democratic State Committee in that case.
How did you go about investigating whether or not ministers were paid?
You talk about a difficult assignment.
Right, I could imagine.
Yeah. What I tried to do was to contact them, gain their confidence, and ask them questions about what happened, what was said, who remembered what was said at what meetings, and how it all transpired. Basically, I was there saying, did you take money, and did you take the money to tell the people that were standing behind you not to go to the polls?
How did you get a list of who to investigate, of who to question?
Well, we had a pretty good idea of a geographical area as to where these things had occurred. We knew who the leaders were within those wards and districts where the problems were alleged to have arisen. So we came up with a short list. I mean, Jerry's office was instrumental in providing insight into who out there was a potential person to be identified and interviewed. You know, so we could develop the information we had to find.
It doesn't seem likely that anybody would admit to being paid to suppress votes.
Well, that was the problem we had in the case.
That was the fundamental problem.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you, too, Sam, it was an odd experience for Adam and I, because we found ourselves working hand in hand with the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Attorney General's Office, and the FBI, among others.
They were as interested in finding the truth as you were.
Yeah, to their credit, Mike Chertoff's office, Mike was the U.S. Attorney at the time, Mike Chertoff's office, in conjunction with the Attorney General's office in New Jersey, really mounted a full-scale investigation. We turned over the results of our investigation to them when it appeared as though we couldn't accomplish, or the facts weren't there to accomplish any sort of a civil result.
Right. And Adam, when you say when Jerry says the facts weren't there, it's you couldn't find facts. That doesn't necessarily mean that the facts weren't there.
Yeah, very often, you know, you keep turning over rocks and there's nothing there, although you know they're out there somewhere.
Right.
And if you have enough time and you can turn over enough rocks, you can usually find the information that you want, that you need.
Let me just say, Sam, I'm convinced that the Republican State Committee sought to suppress the African-American voter turnout, okay? And I think there's enough evidence in that case to suggest that that should be pursued. And if the Republican Party engages in that kind of conduct again, should be pursued. But I want to make it very clear that there was no substance to the fact that Governor Whitman or anybody in her campaign paid off any ministers. I'm convinced that didn't happen.
Well, that's comforting, I guess, to hear. Adam, sometimes you work undercover as part of Dalen's engagements.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that we bring to the table for a law firm or lawyer, for Jerry, is a little bit of imagination. You know, my partner, Fred Boff, who's also a former agent, he and I worked for drug enforcement. I worked undercover for a number of years. Fred was a more hands-on conspiracy type investigator. So we apply those things that we learned in our private sector sense. During the Crazy Eddie case, for instance, we didn't work on that case. We had an undercover case going for a person who's now, I guess, Doris Duke, she's dead now, in California, where we had established a fake identity. We had rented an apartment. We had someone who was a threat to her security.
Doris Duke was the tobacco heiress?
Yeah, she was the richest woman in the world, I guess, at one particular point in time, and probably wasn't the day she died.
Are there any legal problems going undercover, working for an attorney, a private investigator, working for an attorney, going undercover?
No, there's no problems with it, per se. I mean, there are some things that you can't do as a private investigator that you can do as a law enforcement agent. Wiretapping, for example.
Can you bug a room?
You can't bug a room except under very strict, limited circumstances.
Can you tape record conversations?
You can tape record conversations, yes, as long as you're a participant or somebody who consents to that recording is a participant in the conversation.
Certainly within New Jersey, yes.
Only in New Jersey?
Well, there are about 10 or 11 states where you can't. Although federally, in all the federal districts, it's okay to do a one-party consensual.
So if you commit a federal crime, you could do a one-party consensual recording?
Well, no, because the state can still come in and you could have a problem with that. In Florida, for instance, if you were to call someone in Florida, even from New Jersey, and it were on a federal case, and you recorded that call in compliance with the New Jersey statutes, you'd still be in violation of the Florida law. So they could, in theory, present a case.
Suppress that recording.
Well, not in federal court, no. But they could use that recording to pursue a criminal investigation.
Do state laws differ from federal laws regarding these kinds of crimes, bank fraud?
All over the place. I mean, fraud is fraud, regardless of the jurisdiction you're involved in. But these kinds of procedural issues that Adam is talking about, what are the requirements for a wiretap? When can you testify as to certain things that you have uncovered versus the government? That varies by jurisdiction all across the country.
Are federal crimes are the penalties for federal crimes more or less severe than state crimes, or do they differ?
Well, now with the federal sentencing guidelines, generally the federal penalties for fraud are tougher.
They are.
Yeah.
And federal prisons, are they tougher than state prisons in general?
Well, I wouldn't want to spend too much time in any of them except as a visitor, Sam, but...
Are any of them country clubs? We hear about these white-collar criminals going off to federal prisons, which are country clubs.
That's really nonsense. I mean...
Let me ask you a question, Sam. Would you like to stay at the Hotel Plaza for a year, not being able to leave?
No.
You answered your own question. Whatever the facilities are, the jail is not only the facility you're in, but what's happening to you.
Well, incarceration is severe, and it's punishment. But there are forms of punishment. There are varying forms of punishment. And staying at the Plaza for a year wouldn't be that bad, as compared to staying in Rahway State Prison for a year.
You're absolutely right about that, Sam.
So it might be worse staying at the Plaza for a year for me, right? For me. You once had a mole in your office. What was that about?
That was a little bit. It was a case that we were involved in, a federal case.
A mole is an informant for an agency.
Yeah, and we won't discuss the case, but we discovered that the government, in fact, either placed someone there or left someone there who was giving them information on a case that we were working on.
The government paid somebody to...
Well, that's some question. We never proved whether or not they were paid because we never pursued it.
But
we never
you believe that the government knew that there was somebody in your
office? Oh, there's no question that was true.
That reported back to them?
There's no question. I saw reports that were authored. There's no question that was true.
And what was the government's interest in doing that?
I think to find out what the defense was up to in a particular case that was of national importance.
Well, as a defense attorney, do you find the government always plays by the rules, or do they sometimes bend the rules a little bit?
No, the government becomes invested in a result the way any other party to a lawsuit or to a dispute becomes invested in the result. And law enforcement people are human, just like everybody else, and they step over the line also. And it goes back to an issue you raised before, Sam, about misconduct. Is there such a thing as entrapment? Well, there certainly is. There's a line at which the government is so involved in creating the circumstances
Prosecutors
for
become overzealous. They want to
prosecutors-
convict.
No question about it. And it doesn't always involve a quote-unquote search for the truth.
So numbers play a role. The more indictments, the more possibly the larger the departments can grow. The U.S. Attorney's Office is larger today than it was 10 years ago.
If there were less crime, they'd be smaller.
Is that true? Would there be smaller departments if there were less crime?
I said that facetiously. What I mean, the amount of crime is directly proportional to the amount of activity that you generate in a particular area as an enforcement
What
person.
motivates these criminals? What motivates the people who you represent? Is it greed,
Yeah,
for the
money.
most part?
Money.
Greed, power?
Greed, power, I mean, in some cases it's sickness, it's drug addiction that causes a lot of crime. But
Crazy Eddie, a David
But those aren't the
Freeland,
people we
a-
represent.
You only
We don't-
represent innocent people,
We don't
right?
represent those
It was
people.
a- They were only obsessed with those characteristics when you were on the prosecution side or the DEA side. How does the DEA differ from the FBI in investigating crimes?
Much more imagination.
Much.
Yeah, that's where I learned.
In what way?
Well, DEA as an agency gets actively involved with crimes as they occur. So I mean, undercover is a major part of that, or undercover with a government informant of some kind, as opposed to an historical crime. John robbed the bank, someone robbed the bank, let's go see who it is.
What was your impression of defense attorneys like Jerry when you were with the DEA?
I always had a good working relationship with all the attorneys I worked with.
That's interesting because they're portrayed in the media as the bad guys.
Well, I've always respected their questions, and they've always respected my answers, and that was fine. We both acted as professionals, as we still try to do.
Well, certainly, as two of the most respected professionals in the defense community, you seem to have a great working relationship. And it's interesting that you both say that greed plays a role in these criminals' activities. Thank you for tonight's program. This is Sam Rosenfarb, the White Collar Crime Report. Don't let the greed get you. If you have any questions about tonight's show, please write to me, Sam Rosenfarb, 75 Livingston Avenue, Roseland, New Jersey, 07068. Thank you, Jerry. Today, the internet is the fastest growing communications medium in the world. It allows anyone with a computer access to over 30 million people in 145 countries. This vast array of cyberspace is a ripe breeding ground for some of the oldest scams on the books, including pyramid schemes, investment scams, stock swindles, and outright fraud. Hi, this is Sam Rosenfarb, and you're watching the White Collar Crime Report. With me today are Mark Friedman and Ben Carmesino of Friedman Siegelbaum, a law firm in Roseland, New Jersey. Mark is one of the country's finest attorneys dealing with computer law issues. Ben is a computer expert, an associate of the firm, and has fraud audit experience. Mark, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started in this highly specialized area of law.
Well, Sam, first let me say that both Ben and I are very pleased to be here today.
Thank you.
And we think that you are providing a very valuable public service to your listenership. Within the past few months or so, every major news magazine, Time, Newsweek, Forbes, Business Week, and every major newspaper and wire service in the country has carried one story or another dealing with this increasing problem which we call crimes on the internet. And I certainly hope that by the end of this program, your viewers have a fuller idea of what the Internet is, and more particularly, what the problems are that each of them may be facing in the future.
Well, certainly a fascinating topic, and anybody who's read a newspaper or a magazine in the last few months has heard of the Internet and crimes on the Internet. How did you get started in this?
Well, let me answer that question by going back to 1977. At that time, when I was only 5 years out of law school, I began to represent a business out in Whippany, New Jersey, known as Chatlow Systems. Chatlow's consulted us because it had purchased a computer system from National Cash Register Corporation, as it was known, which flatly and utterly didn't work the way it was supposed to. As a result of the computer system's failure...
That company's now part of AT&T, isn't it?
As a result of that computer system's failure, Chatlow's, which was a small manufacturing company, suffered hundreds of thousands of dollars of damages. And we filed a lawsuit on behalf of Chatlow's. In 1979, we tried that case for 4 weeks in federal court, and we won that case. The case was picked up by the Star Ledger, and within a few days after the decision, there was a large story in the Star Ledger because of the landmark nature of the case. Within hours, that story was picked up by both the Associated Press and the UPI and reported in every major newspaper in the country.
What made it so interesting?
Well, it was the first case of its kind where the purchaser of a computer system had recovered damages against a seller which exceeded by many times the cost of the system. In fact, in that case, the system cost approximately $30,000, and we recovered damages, as I recall, approximately 5 times that amount, which were a consequence of the computer system.
And that's what made it different, the fact that the user of this software that didn't work and hardware that didn't work.
Well, what it did is it
got a multiple.
It put sellers in the computer industry on notice for the first time, clearly and unmistakably, that they would be held accountable in courts of law for certain sales practices which they might be engaging in.
Ben, how did you get involved in the computer area and computer law?
Well, interestingly enough, I started out as a programmer, and I worked for several years as a consultant, and then I moved into banking where I did EDP auditing, where I basically went in and audited computer systems to make sure that they were in compliance with the various federal and state regulations, and also checking for fraud, issues of fraud, and that type of thing.
Computer systems are ripe for fraud schemes.
Exactly. I think everyone has heard of the classic salami slicing case, where a programmer would go in and modify a program such that it would throw off hundredths of a penny, say, into his own account, which no one auditing their own statements would care about. But
sure, if it took a penny a month from my account, who would care?
Who would notice? Who would care? But over a period of time,
that's called the salami scheme.
It's called the salami because it's just small slices of salami, really, and over a period of time, it could run into the hundreds, thousands of dollars.
Sure, if you took a penny from everybody's statement every month, it could run into a lot of money. Right. Soon you're talking about real money. Mm-hmm. Right. Mark, what's an example of a crime on the Internet?
Well, I can give you several examples which I think would help illustrate the problem that we're going to be talking about today. In 1988, for example, a self-replicating virus was introduced into a computer system at the University of California, Berkeley. This was known as the Internet worm. And in common parlance, this worm wriggled out of control and infected between 6,000 and 7,000 computers which were networked with each other. That's one example. 5 months ago, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory admitted that one of its employees had been using its computer systems to unlawfully distribute pornography throughout the country.
Pornography on the Internet?
That's correct. I'll give you
Sounds
another.
lascivious.
I'll give you another very interesting example. Not too long ago in Missouri, a stockbroker logged onto the Internet and put out information to the effect that Donald Trump was interested in purchasing a piece of property owned by a corporation in Missouri. That stockbroker then began to buy and sell shares in that particular corporation's stock, realizing vast profits as a result.
He created a hot market.
Well, that's right. Of course, Donald Trump had never heard of the corporation, had never heard of the property, and it was all fabricated by this stockbroker in order to realize these profits.
Unbelievable.
Just to give you one more example, I brought with me an article that appeared in the New York Times just 2 weeks ago, indicating that a federal computer security agency had detected a whole new scheme of which would allow people to invade computers in a way that was heretofore unknown. As the Computer Protection Agency of the federal government reported, the new form of attack leaves many of the 20 million government, business, university, and home computers on the global internet vulnerable to eavesdropping and theft. The problem is increasing every day.
What is the internet, Ben? Tell us what that is.
Perhaps the most important point to make about the internet is that no one really owns it and no one really controls it. Most people have heard of commercial computer systems like Prodigy and CompuServe, where there's a corporate structure and people, and it's identifiable.
They're both part of the internet.
Exactly, exactly. The internet, the term internet is used to refer to the global interconnection of thousands of computers. And people would say go to a CompuServe or a Prodigy in order to access that internet, but no one really controls it. It has just evolved over the years, really.
You mentioned a computer virus, that somebody threw out this virus. Maybe you could explain how that virus affects computers and what makes it a crime.
Well, like many attorneys in our firm, Ben particularly has a highly technical background. We have been required in recent years, because of the complexity of the subject matter, to hire as attorneys people who spent the first part of their professional lives as computer scientists or computer professionals, and who then went on to law school to be able to marry the two interests. And I think that Ben is particularly well suited to discuss what a virus is and how a virus works.
The technology almost leaves the law behind, because it goes so fast. There are crimes that are being committed that lawyers can't even comprehend.
Well, let me put it to you this way, if I might, and then Ben can address the issue of the virus. Think of it this way, Sam. In order for our law to be an effective guide to people's conduct, it has to have a high degree of predictability. You have to know tomorrow, the next day, the day after that, what conduct is lawful and what conduct is unlawful.
Sure, if I didn't know what was lawful, I wouldn't know how to behave.
Right. As a result, law has to change very slowly. If there are dramatic changes in the law that take place on a regular basis, people like you and me don't know how to guide our conduct. On the other hand, we have a technology that is changing more rapidly every day and that is creating new problems which were unimaginable a year ago.
Like the distribution of pornography on the internet.
Exactly, and how do we make our existing body of law, in this case, for this program, particularly our existing body of criminal law, deal with problems which, when those laws were designed, were totally unfathomable? That's the challenge that is laid before those of us who specialize in the practice of computer law.
And that's what makes it so highly specialized.
That's correct.
Having said that, what is a virus? A computer virus?
A virus is a...
we all know what the flu is.
The flu is,
right.
and in many ways it resembles a virus that would infect a human being, say like the flu. A computer virus is the term applied to a type of computer program that replicates itself. It's inserted into a computer system, and on its own will seek out other computer systems and other computer files to infect. Once it infects them...
And it travels through the telephone lines?
It can travel through, say, on the internet. If I gave you a file over the internet, say, a great game program, and said, Sam, here's a great game program, you'll love it, and you load it up, and you start playing the game, and all of a sudden, a funny message comes up, or your computer shuts off, or something.
Don't you need passwords to go in between to access computers on the internet?
Not necessarily, no. Ideally, a computer system will be protected by a security system, what is called a firewall in the industry, which basically prevents unauthorized users from gaining access to the system. Many times, however, a system will either not have a security system, or the security system has been configured improperly, which would allow unauthorized people to enter into the system.
Wow. You told me before, Mark, that there was a theft of some thousands of these passwords. How did that occur?
That's right. In February of this year, it was discovered that a band of computer thieves, cyber criminals, cyber punks, somehow had unlawfully obtained thousands upon thousands of internet passwords.
The Willie Sutton of the 90s.
That's right, which would allow them and their confederates to start penetrating computers owned by other people, as Ben had described.
So if somebody's able to access a computer, unauthorized access, can they get into a bank and start withdrawing funds and distribute those funds to an account that also is unauthorized?
Well, the way I used to be a banker, and the way banks would prevent that from happening is that they would have two or more individuals do a single transaction, say, where one person would enter in a transaction, but before that transaction was affected, another person, a separate individual, would have to enter in that transaction. That, however, is not a foolproof way of preventing fraud, because someone, for example, could steal two IDs and pretend to be two different people and put the same transaction through. If they decided to go through a bank's, say, front end or the menus of a banking system. Alternatively, they could go in and sneak around the back and use and access the data files directly and modify those files such that theoretically, yes, they could steal.
How did this idea of an internet originate?
Interestingly enough, we can probably thank the Soviet Union for the internet in many ways. And the reason I say that is because many of this country's great institutions, for example, this country's interstate highway system, its educational system, were developed as a result of the perceived threat from the Soviet Union. So the internet actually began back in the 60s as a...
Before you go on, tell us about the Soviet Union, how it began the internet. We'll be back with a right after the short break with Ben Carmesino and Mark Friedman of Friedman Siegelbaum. Hi, this is Sam Rosenthal for the White Collar Crime Report. We're talking about crimes on the internet with two experts of computer law, Ben Carmesino and Mark Friedman. Ben, right before the break, you were telling us how we could thank the Soviet Union for the introduction to the internet.
To a certain extent. The internet began in the 60s through the military computer systems. The government felt that by distributing its computing power, it was less likely that the nation's computers would be destroyed in a Soviet missile attack. So the theory was, rather than centralizing the country's supercomputers, which controlled its defense systems, everything, spread them out and then let them talk to each other. And that's
what
really
kind of information is on these on the internet program?
Well, of course, we have highly classified military and defense information, but I think what is more important for ordinary people to know is that it can include information about their credit, their financial history, their family's health records, credit card numbers. Practically anything which can be electronically stored can be present on the internet. In fact, within the past few months, the Rolling Stones broadcast the first internet concert. They did their Voodoo Lounge tour from some other location on the internet
And it
distributed
was
throughout the
broadcast
world.
just like TV?
That's correct.
Are crimes increasing on the internet?
Crimes are increasing. Just a few years ago, and I had occasion to look at these statistics recently, there were 50 reported crimes on the internet, 50. Last year, there were approximately 1,500 reported crimes, and we who practice in this area have every reason to believe that there are many thousands more which are totally undetectable or unprosecutable.
What kind of crimes, Ben, are detected and undetected?
There are numerous. In fact, the types and numbers of crimes are only limited really by the imagination of the criminal. For example, there was a recent case where an individual had sent President Clinton a very threatening message over the internet. He basically said he'd come to Washington and blow his head off. And obviously, the Secret Service...
There may be many of us who feel the same way.
If recent news accounts bear that out, yes. There was that crime, those types of crimes. There was industrial espionage.
And the people creating these crimes are anonymous, right? You can't tell where this internet message originates.
Typically, no. They're very crafty. They're very capable of hiding their tracks and sometimes adopting someone else's ID, sometimes going through different countries to hide their trail.
Did they find this person threatening the president?
They did. He was arrested.
And how was he detected? What flaw did he commit?
My understanding was he wasn't very smart, and his message actually had his internet address on it.
He wasn't very smart at all.
No.
But the kinds of communications on the internet can be anonymous.
Oh, certainly,
Is that
yes.
how these pornography crimes?
Yes.
That's correct. Pornography is a separate issue. But if I might just comment on something that Ben said for a moment. You have to understand that the internet is really an international communications web. That means, for example, that were you to log on the internet, Sam, you could communicate just as easily with somebody in Ceylon or somebody in some other foreign country as you could were you just calling me on the telephone next door. Now just think about it a second. If you have somebody in some foreign country who decides to log on to the internet to unlawfully copy or steal information which we have here on a computer system in New Jersey, first of all, how do you detect that such a crime has occurred? Secondly, that person is outside the boundaries of the United States and can't be prosecuted. And thirdly, it's unlikely, unless it were a case of extreme importance, that some foreign prosecuting authority would look into it. Those are the kinds of problems that we see.
What's the federal government doing about these problems?
Well, the federal government has statutes which pre-existed the computer age, under which some of these acts are being prosecuted. Traditional wire fraud, mail fraud.
Does this fit into
and
that?
so forth. Well, sometimes it's very difficult to fit these crimes into that, and Congress has enacted 2 statutes which are intended to deal with this, at least at the federal level. In 1984, Congress enacted something called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which essentially makes it criminal to unlawfully access a computer that's used by the federal government, a computer that's used by a financial institution, or computers used by ordinary citizens in different states. And the penalties are very substantial. It can be up to 10 years in jail and 6-figure fines.
Are these crimes being prosecuted?
Yeah, they are being prosecuted with greater frequency. In 1986, Congress enacted another statute called the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which in effect takes the concept of the old wiretap statute, which makes it unlawful to put in third-party wiretaps, and moves it up to the level of electronic communications. And again, these 2 particular statutes were enacted specifically to deal with computer crime. We do have a whole host of other federal statutes that exist, copyright infringement, for example, which are intended to provide a seamless web to catch these offenders, but it doesn't happen on it.
And I should also say that the states themselves, beginning in the 80s, enacted their own computer crime legislations. And New Jersey, for example, has its own computer crime legislation.
What are some of the matters you get involved in at your firm?
Well, on the criminal side, let's talk about that first. Many times over the past few years, I have been consulted by clients who ask me the following question: can we access somebody's computer in Vermont, in New Hampshire, in Nevada, in some other state?
Without
authorization. And usually, the reason for it is because our client believes that somebody else in another state is using unlawfully pirated software which belongs to them. And they want to go in not to do damage to the other person's computer, not to steal anything from the other person's computer, but as with a television, to turn it on and look and see if there's any evidence of the client software or data having been misappropriated.
And they could find that, Ben, just by going into that computer system?
Yes.
They could tell what programs are being used?
Particularly if they have the access codes. Many times, say, a consultant would be given the access codes to his client's computer system for normal purposes.
Right.
And if he feels he's not being paid quickly enough, he may go in using those codes and
wreak havoc.
And of course the client has to be counseled on whether that proposed act would violate New Jersey law, would violate the law of the jurisdiction in which the other computer is located, or perhaps violate one of the federal statutes to which I referred.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
Very interesting stuff.
Recently I read in the Times there was a criminal who was released from prison. His name was Fiber Optic.
Yes.
And the headline says, "A computer cowboy emerges from prison as a hero in the electronic salon." Now, this individual gained notoriety and celebrity because he was able to access these computer codes. It seems the kind of ingenuity, creativity, the brain power that's required to do this can be put to some better use. What motivates these people?
Well, I think that from my experience and based on my observations, computer criminals are motivated by something different from that which motivates the ordinary criminal. The ordinary criminal, the people who we read about in the papers, are generally motivated by greed, money, sometimes jealousy. I think that in large part, those who commit computer crime are motivated by the intellectual challenge of showing that they can do something which does require ingenuity and talent, and that, in fact, they would not be detected nor prosecuted. I guess, in a sense, if we go back to one of the famous crimes of the early years in this country, there were two young men who decided they wanted to commit the perfect crime, an undetectable murder, merely for the challenge of it. Mm-hmm. Well, I think today there are people out there who are very sophisticated in computer technology who, again, want to commit crime just for the challenge of it, to see that they can get away with a perfect crime.
Have you come across with criminals who've attempted to obfuscate some of the computer passwords and enter into areas that are unlawful in your experience, Ben?
Actually, just to relate this to a news article I read recently, there's a internet security expert who has made his reputation being the internet computer expert, and someone recently broke into his system just to demonstrate that they could do it. And they left a message behind. There was no other trace other than this message to the effect that, yes, we were here and we rummaged around your system.
How do we protect ourselves, those that use computers in business, at home, personally, banks? Is there a way to make it foolproof? To barricade ourselves behind the firewall, as Ben says?
Well, I think it's important to understand that you do not expose your computer to this risk until you hook onto a network which goes outside of your location. If, Sam, you are just within your own home or your own office in front of your PC and there's no telephone hookup with anybody to the outside, the danger doesn't exist. It's secure. The problem...
Well, that's important for the viewers to know.
Exactly.
It only begins when you hook up to a modem.
It only begins when your computer starts dialing other computers which are located somewhere else. Now, the problem, of course, is that as our ability to build these password systems increases, the ingenuity and ability of the criminals to bypass or penetrate that system increases, it seems today, at an even greater pace.
Well, certainly the headlines keep screaming of more and more crimes on the internet.
Right, and my guess is that after this show, viewers who are at least now alerted to the problem are going to notice in their newspapers and magazines and television reports increasing instances of the kind of crimes we're talking about. What I'd like to do particularly is talk about pornography. You had asked me to comment on it earlier. Pornography, and particularly pedophilia, is getting to be a very serious problem. You know, children, like my children, have a natural affinity for computers, perhaps unlike adults. They love to sit there and they love to communicate with others. And pedophiles, those who are interested in juveniles for unlawful purposes, will sign on and establish a relationship of trust and confidence with the juvenile, then arrange to meet that juvenile who has no reason to believe there's a problem, and commit acts which would be criminal. For example, very recently, a 51-year-old man from Seattle, Alan Paul Barlow was his name, was prosecuted for sexually explicit messages which he was sending to a 14-year-old girl by virtue of the internet.
Mark, I want to cut you off for, I think we need to address this at another show. It's a fascinating subject. I'd like to do another show on crimes on the internet.
We'd be delighted.
This is Sam Rosenfarb for the White Collar Crime Report. Don't let the greed get you. If you have any questions about tonight's program, you can write to me, Sam Rosenfarb, 75 Livingston Avenue, Roseland, New Jersey. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.